Hey, people of planet Earth. Unless you've been living a decent, normal life, you're probably aware that Bethesda Game Studios is releasing their new video game, Starfield, in the first half of 2023, assuming it doesn't get delayed again. This video is going to discuss Starfield in depth. I'm going to explain what I'd like to see out of this game versus what I expect to see when it finally comes out. And there is a galaxy of difference between the two. Galaxy of difference. Did you see what I did there? Anyhow, I know last week I said I was going to review weapon mods for Fallout 4 next time, but that was before I realized talking over B-roll footage of Starfield is way easier than recording new Fallout 4 gameplay, and it will probably get me more views, so this is what we're doing. I'm going to go over a lot of topics, so strap yourself in and let's launch this video. First, I want to talk about the game being delayed. It was originally slated for a November 2022 release. Now it has a nebulous release date sometime in the first half of 2023. I'm sure many are disappointed by the delay, but as far as I'm concerned, it's guaranteed to be a good thing. Every single Bethesda game ever released, without exception, has been unacceptably buggy. So I hope they delay Starfield as much as needed to give us a stable build on launch day for once. Even with several months of extra dev time, I'm still expecting a barely functional product on release day. Maybe Starfield will surprise everyone and not be a janky mess on day one, but I'm not counting on it. Luckily, I'm not going to be playing this game on day 1, or day 10, or day 100. Unless this channel blows up like and I have a significant financial incentive to buy this game and talk about it, I'll first be playing Starfield in maybe 5 years, after all of its major bugs have been patched out, all of its DLCs have been released, and I can purchase the complete package on a Steam sale for $30 or less. By then, I'll hopefully have a new PC that's well above the required specifications, and I'll be able to play the game at a locked 4K 60 FPS. That's how I'll be enjoying the game, in half a decade. You might ask, why am I even bothering to talk about Starfield then, if I won't be playing it on release? Well, it's because it's fun to speculate and make predictions. When the game does finally come out, you can play it for yourself and look back at this video to see if I was a Nostradamus or just a dumbass. Let's talk about graphics and performance. Starfield seems to be lacking in terms of next-gen graphical features. I highly doubt there will be any ray tracing at all in this title. Reflections will likely be handled in screen space on water surfaces and limited to cube maps for everything else, just like in Fallout 4. Shadow maps will have more distant coverage. Obviously we'll get higher resolution textures and probably some parallax occlusion mapping, and there looks to be new volumetric fog effects. But that's about all I expect to see in terms of new visuals, and honestly, that's okay with me. Back in the day I used to be a huge graphics whore. Nowadays, I'm just a whore. I just want to be able to play the damn game on my outdated computer, and I don't care so much about the fancy visual bells and whistles that I'll end up having to turn off anyways. It's clear that Starfield's graphics are an iterative improvement over Fallout 4 and 76, and that's all they need to be. Not every game has to push the visual envelope. On the flip side, we have performance, and this is an area where I am not optimistic in the slightest. Pre-release footage is all rendered with a 30 FPS target, and it drops below that frequently. And I haven't seen any evidence that Starfield is going to feature a 60 FPS mode on Xbox Series consoles. Doubling the frame rate isn't as easy as some people think. If all it takes is dropping the resolution to 1080p, Bethesda would be hyping up a 60 FPS mode already. The fact that they haven't mentioned it once doesn't bode well. If other Creation Engine titles are anything to go by, Starfield is going to be heavily CPU limited. That means Bethesda could set the resolution to 320 by 200, and it wouldn't do jack squat to help the frame rate. In the worst case scenario, Starfield could be another Gotham Knights situation, where even the highest end Intel CPUs cannot reach a solid 60 FPS without lowering settings. And next-gen consoles struggle to hold on to 30. I honestly hope performance isn't that bad, but there's no way to know until the game releases. All I can do is speculate based on what little footage has been released, and what I see worries me. The locations in Starfield all remind me of the draw call hell that is Fallout 4's Corvega factory. Look at all the tiny modular objects, and realize that every single one of them has to be processed on your poor CPU. We can only hope that Bethesda finds a way to optimize the game as much as possible. And even if 60 FPS isn't achievable on Xbox Series consoles, it would be nice to at least have a 40 FPS option. That still wouldn't be very good, but it would be an okay middle ground. Sadly, right now I don't think we're going to even reach that. I predict a choppy, barely 30 FPS presentation on Xbox, and a struggle to hit 60, even for those with top-of-the-line PCs. I sincerely hope my prediction turns out to be dead wrong, but I'm just calling it like I see it. Anyways, now I want to talk about procedural generation and the fact that Starfield will feature over 1,000 planets. When I first heard the famous 1,000 planets figure, I was extremely wary because the last time BGS tried its hand at large-scale procedural generation was in the 1996 DOS game, The Elder Scrolls II: Daggerfall. I've attempted to get into it several times. I've tried both the DOS version and the new Unity source port, but I always give up in boredom after a few hours. Daggerfall's world is super massive. I've read that it's close to the size of Great Britain. It features over 4,000 dungeons and 5,000 towns. But as soon as you visit a few of them, you've already seen them all. And that's my problem with procedural generation. I would greatly prefer exploring a dozen unique, handcrafted planets than 1,000 copy-pasted planets that are drawn from a dozen templates. Obviously, Starfield's environments are going to be more detailed and diverse than a DOS game from 1996. But even so, what will differentiate one frozen ice ball world from another? Small variations in gravity or atmospheric conditions won't cut it. Going back to Daggerfall as an example, technically every single tavern has a unique name and layout, but functionally they are all the same. People remember the Bannered Mare in Whiterun because it was a unique location populated with NPCs you learned to care about. Nobody is going to remember the King's Ferry Tavern from Daggerfall because it's no different from all 10,000 other taverns in the Iliac Bay. The only saving grace I can think of is the possibility that respectable quantities of handcrafted content will be sprinkled over these 1,000 planets. If there were 1,000,000 planets, you could forget about it. But 1,000 is a number small enough that I could imagine designers and testers spending a few hours working on each planet, making sure there's some reason to visit all of them, even if it's just a large deposit of resources for settlement building or a space pirate hideout. On the other hand, asset reuse is going to be a massive issue no matter what. These 1,000 planets are not going to have their own rocks, dirt, grass, and sand. You'll be seeing the same models and textures everywhere, and I expect it to be most painfully obvious when it comes to flora and fauna. I would bet my life savings, all $700, that there won't be well thought out, distinctive ecosystems in Starfield. Don't expect to see different plants and animals every time you land on a new planet. Most planets will probably share the same small pool of life forms. Think about it from a design perspective. Let's say that of the 1,000 plus planets, 100 of them have life. The rest are dead rocks. Modeling, texturing, rigging, animating, and implementing just one unique creature takes hundreds, if not thousands, of man-hours. Skyrim had somewhere between 50 and 70 types of creatures, depending on if you're willing to count Creation Club content and if variants count as their own creatures and so on. The number depends on how you count it, but let's take the highest, most generous estimate and assume that Starfield will have 3 times as many creatures as Skyrim, which would be an insane amount of work. Even then, that only gives us 200 creatures to fill 100 planets. 2 creatures is not enough to build an interesting planet-wide ecosystem. I'd say you need at least 10, at a minimum, to do that. You also need more than 2 enemy types to make combat encounters interesting. That means the same creatures will have to appear on multiple planets. If Bethesda is crafty, they'll tie the lack of plant and animal diversity into the story and explain it away with a plot point about all life in the galaxy being seeded by an alien artifact a billion years ago or whatever. Let's talk more about the planets themselves. One thing we have no information on is how large they're going to be. There's no way in hell we'll have realistic 1-to-1 scale planets, and honestly, planets of that size would be tedious to explore anyways. Instead, I expect each planet to have a Skyrim-sized landmass to explore, perhaps 5 kilometers squared on average. One feature I predict won't be in Starfield, but I would be extremely impressed to see, is being able to wrap around a planet by moving to one edge of the terrain and ending up on the other side of the map. I think this feature will be too difficult for Bethesda to implement on a technical level, so I'm expecting a lame, generic, "you cannot go that way, turn back" message when you reach the edge of a planet. Even though planets are round, it should be possible to circumnavigate them. Also, in my opinion, if planets are going to be of any reasonable size, land vehicles are a necessary inclusion. That we haven't seen a hint of them in any gameplay so far is disconcerting. The new jetpack is nice, but if most planets are going to be sparsely populated rocks with precious little to find, a fast vehicle will be essential for making exploring less tedious. I'll be very disappointed, but not surprised, if Starfield doesn't have any vehicles and we're forced to trot everywhere on foot. Whether there are vehicles or not, this game is going to have a hard time grabbing people. Generating a random 5x5 kilometer height map and plopping down some rocks and grass is the easy part. What's difficult is spawning dozens of points of interest to give the player a reason to stay on a planet and explore for a while, because staring at the scenery isn't going to hold anyone's attention for more than a few minutes. This leads me to speculate about something we have literally zero information about, and that's procedurally generated dungeons. And by dungeons, I don't mean Elder Scrolls style dungeons, but rather caves, space pirate hideouts, science labs, mining complexes, the science fiction equivalent of what dungeons are in the Elder Scrolls. Thinking back to Skyrim once again, that game had approximately 200 dungeons, all of them made by hand. Even if Starfield's level designers could crank out double that number, 400 dungeons is not nearly enough content for 1,000 planets. Do the math, it doesn't add up. That means the game has to have procedurally generated dungeons a la Daggerfall. And if they're anything like Daggerfall, they could end up being really awful, boring, confusing, and potentially broken locations to visit. I want to be positive, but it's really hard for me to believe this content will be any good. I suppose we'll have to wait and see. But let's leave dungeons behind and look back up into space. Think about the 1,000 planets figure again. What is a planet, anyways? Does a moon count as a planet? We know that it's possible to land on moons, since most of the vertical slice gameplay takes place on the surface of a moon named Crete. Another moon called Vectera was also shown off for a second, so I'm fairly certain moons count towards the 1,000 planet total. I would love if it was possible to seamlessly fly from a planet's surface into space and vice versa, but it was confirmed months ago that that's not going to be in the game, sadly. In all likelihood, each planet will be its own discrete world space, completely separate from outer space itself. To land on a planet, I think you'll need to enter a menu and go through a loading screen. The load might be disguised as a cutscene that shows you your ship landing on the planet, but it's still going to be a massive immersion breaker. It's an even bigger shame when you consider how many other games have continuous planet-to-space transitions. No Man's Sky, Star Citizen, hell, even Frontier Elite 2 from 1993, for Christ's sake. Unless Starfield's delay is being used to implement this feature, I don't expect to see it, and I think this oversight, even though it seems minor in the grand scheme of things, will be one of the game's biggest disappointments, and a permanent sore spot for many people. It's not a deal breaker for me, but it will make landing on planets a lot less exciting. Speaking of landings, I'm also fairly certain that it's not going to be possible to land on all planets. Some of them will be gas giants, or have average temperatures over 200 degrees Celsius, or have more than double Earth's gravity. I'd imagine attempting to land on these planets will result in your ship exploding immediately. In our own solar system, that immediately rules out Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, leaving just Earth, Mars, and a handful of moons and dwarf planets open for on-the-ground exploration. What's happening back on Earth is one of Starfield's biggest mysteries, and obviously it's going to remain a mystery until the game launches. Personally, I believe Bethesda is going to take the lazy route of having Earth be completely destroyed by a cataclysmic event, because trying to represent all the different countries and factions on a futuristic vision of Earth would honestly be enough content for an entire game of its own. There's no way Bethesda could do it justice, so I'm expecting Earth to be gone, or perhaps the surface will be inaccessible and you'll be shot down if you try to land, and will only be able to go there in a DLC. I think the latter option is less likely because it would mean more work than just having the planet laid to waste. If Earth does end up being inhabited and explorable on day one, I will be amazed. I want to go over character creation a little bit. I actually like what's been shown so far. There seems to be a great variety of character backgrounds to choose from. This could very well be the Bethesda game with the most open-ended character backstory ever. But whether that ends up being true or not hinges on how the main quest is set up. I'm half expecting a lengthy forced intro sequence to railroad the player down a linear path. If that doesn't happen, I'll be pleasantly surprised. Starfield might also have more opportunities for player choice and role-playing than any previous Bethesda title, but it depends on how well conversations are implemented. There are positive signs. The voiced protagonist from Fallout 4 is gone, and the game has over 200,000 lines of recorded dialogue. An Oblivion-style persuasion minigame is present, which might be interesting. Will Shen, who was the lead quest designer for Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, is now lead quest designer on Starfield. I think these are all good reasons to be optimistic about Starfield's story and quests. I'm expecting something great here, and I'll be really disappointed if the game fails to deliver. The final thing I'll talk about is the on-foot combat, which doesn't seem to be improved much from Fallout 4. First-person animations do look a lot better, far less stiff than anything we've seen before, but they still lag well behind the rest of the game industry. Third-person animations don't really look any better than previous Bethesda games, but at least it seems we'll be able to see holstered weapons in third person again after this feature was annoyingly absent from Fallout 4. Unfortunately, I don't think there will be tactical reloads in Starfield, since the player slaps the bolt release or whatever it is on the Grendel, which looks a lot like a P90, even if the magazine isn't fully depleted. That's a shame. At least the weapon has a built-in digital ammo counter right on the magazine, which is awesome. Modders will be able to easily create new weapons with ammo counters without making use of a script extender that won't be available to console users. We haven't seen any weapons that reload one round at a time, but since they were featured in Fallout 76, it's reasonable to assume Bethesda won't go backwards and not include any in Starfield. The moon this FPS gameplay takes place on has a gravity 0.55 times that of Earth, which makes me wonder what effect, if any, gravity will have on game mechanics. On this moon, one would expect items to weigh half as much, allowing you to carry twice as much loot on your person. This could lead to a funny situation where you travel to a planet with higher gravity and suddenly end up over-encumbered. Beyond that, I wonder if guns will fire actual projectiles that are affected by gravity, or if they'll all be hit-scan like in previous games. I'm heavily leaning towards the latter being more likely, although maybe throwing weapons like grenades will be affected by gravity. Trying to throw a grenade on a high-gravity planet and seeing it drop right next to your feet would be a hilarious way to die. Honestly, just talking about this game is getting me hyped for it a little. Even if it turns out to be mediocre on release, I guarantee, eventually, modders will treat this game like a blank canvas and turn it into something amazing. There's going to be Star Wars mods, there will be Stargates, Warhammer 40k stuff. This game is going to be an experience, and I can't wait to play it in 5 years. Toodles, everybody.